Good evening, all of you. As your colleague mentioned, I'm Renald Fortier. I'm one of the curator emeritus of the Ingenium Group of Science and Technology Museum of Canada. Tonight we'll be talking about the Curtiss H series, the twin-engine flying boats, and the Felixstowe F series derived from the Curtiss H series. Incidentally, the providing frightfulness for that ruthless pirate Fritz is a quote I found online from a British newspaper, which I found interesting and decided to use as the title. So I won't try to bore you too much. Well, very quickly, the Canada Aviation Space Museum is the Canadian equivalent of your National Air and Space Museum. It's in the national capital, Ottawa, as yours is in the national capital, Washington. You can see on top of the screen some of the aircraft we have, and as Air and Space, we are, not we because I don't work there anymore, I'm retired. The museum has a collection of military and civilian aircraft dealing with Canadian aviation history, either made in Canada, used by Canadians, or in some cases, aircraft that are significant or were significant in the history of aviation worldwide. So we'll now move from the first slide to the second slide and begin the presentation with several slides of introduction. I will try not to read the text, first of all, because it's boring, and second, because, well, you can read it also. This is a photo of the first seaplane. It's a float plane. It's French. Monsieur Fabre was an engineer. He designed this thing because he was certainly interested in aviation. France, before the First World War, was one of the cradles of aviation. No offense intended, but after the Wright brothers sort of like eventually lost their advantage around 1908, 1909, the French sort of took over. That's why you have the first flight across the Channel, 1909, and eventually by 1913, many, if not most, of the world records in endurance, speed, altitude, or distance covered were French. The airplane in question is a canard. Canard is a French word, canard. It's a bit like aileron, empennage, or fuselage. They're French words. This one doesn't have ailerons, however, was not very well controlled, but it flew in 1910. Two of those are still around, replicas, I believe, and there is one which I think is original in the Musée de l'Air et de l'Espace in Paris, which is, by the way, a fantastic place. If you ever have the chance, it's amazing. And their collections of books and photos are incredible. I had the pleasure to work there for a couple of weeks. That was fun. However, Fabre was not the first person to build and test, at least he tried, a seaplane. So you have this dentist, English dentist, to design this flyer. It didn't work too well. From the looks of it, he was trying to start the engine, and he was sort of fiddling with it to such an extent that the aircraft sort of tilted either to the left or to the right, I don't know, and sort of turned over and sank. He later tried to fly it. It didn't work. It could go at a reasonably good speed on water, but could never get off the ground. Now, the fact that he was, at least he thought or said, he was being spied on by Germans did not help his reputation. That and his interest in aviation led some people to call him the mad dentist. But he certainly tried. Like many people tried to fly at that time. Hundreds, possibly even a few thousand of people tried to fly between, let's say, the late 19th century and 1914. Most of them couldn't fly. Some of them got hurt or killed, and only a few actually managed to get into the air. Fewer still managed to create a company which survived for any length of time. But that was how aviation began. Humphreys was not the first with a seaplane, however. Mr. Kress, from the looks of it, was the first, and we see his airplane here, 3 wings mounted one after the other, tested from a small lake near Vienna. It was a small lake, so in order to make his test runs, he had to sort of like go all the way down the lake, make a turn, and go down the other way. On one of the trials, he made a turn that was a bit too tight, so one of the wings touched the water, the aircraft capsized and sank. He was lucky to survive. No offense intended, the Wright brothers were not the first people with an airplane. The Wright brothers did not invent the airplane. I managed to come across something like 25, 30 airplanes or helicopters, mainly airplanes, a few helicopters, which were built and or tested before December 1903. And I probably missed a few of them. So a lot of people were interested in flying. One of them was Mr. Curtis. And that's, as far as I know, his first seaplane, little float plane, which was tested 1911. All those machines were almost handmade because no one had designed an airplane before. No one had flown an airplane before. So very often the first flight, if it was successful at all, and most of these machines made a small hop, brief hop, more or less uncontrolled, because that's one of the Wright, but that's what's interesting about the Wright brothers. They did not invent the airplane. What they invented was a control system, which allowed them to control their airplanes and which made possible the 1-minute flight in December 1903. That and the strong winds at Kitty Hawk. Other people had more, something like 30, as I mentioned, designed and built airplanes, but their control system were almost non-existent. So they could make little hops, but they couldn't turn, if they could make a hop at all. But Mr. Curtis certainly made more than a few hops. Now that's his seaplanes. He also pioneered flying boats. The image at the bottom is the January 1912 flying boat. The pictures on the right, which are actual photos, show the other aircraft, July 1912. The Will cigarette, it's part of a series of cigarette cards. Now, cigarette cards, well, I'm old enough not to remember those things, but there were like little cards in packages of tea, for example. But there were, in cigarette packages, you could have cards of which might have been airplanes, baseball, anything you can think of probably, which are very collectible today. So if you have some of those, or if you find some of those, you might have, if not huge sums of money, you might have enough money to buy yourself a few meals. Now, if you look at the picture on the top of the page there, you will note that the bottom of the flying boat's hull is very smooth. There's no kink. There is no step. Now, the step, again, I won't read the text, it's boring, but the step was pretty well, as far as I can figure out again, developed and engineered or designed by an Englishman, a barrister of all forms of employment, who had developed the idea some months, if not a year or two before 1911, when the Waterbird first flew. So the first step on a seaplane was British. And if you look at the picture at the bottom, on the right of the page there, you can almost see the step at the rear of the single float of that float plane. So lots of ideas were being developed. Biplanes, triplanes, pushers, tractors, all sort of crazy ideas were being tested, most of which didn't really work. But something that did work was the flying boat. Something like that. Now, 1913, Daily Mail came up with an idea. Daily Mail had a lot of ideas like that, competitions. This one was to cross the Atlantic using a flying machine, an aeroplane of some sort, within a certain period of time. I think it was several days, so it wasn't a question of going one place, crashing, waiting 6 months, and making it across. You had to do the crossing within a certain period of time with a sizable amount of money as a reward. Now, Mr. Wanamaker, who was mentioned in the previous slide, again, I won't read the text. He asked Mr. Curtis to design a flying boat, which turned out to be the biggest seaplane on planet Earth, the America. Very advanced design, there's no doubt about it, but if you try to advance technology, it doesn't always work. In that case, the aircraft had some issues. Being underpowered, for example. I do believe they mounted a third engine on top of the upper wing to try to see if that could help. It didn't help all that much. But again, they were pushing the envelope. Everyone was pushing the envelope because by 1913, 1914, 10 years after the flight of the Wright brothers, you had airplanes that could do 125 miles an hour. Now they were racing planes, but again, you're looking for something that could barely get off the ground to something that could do 125 miles an hour and maintain that speed for more than 30 seconds. That was pretty impressive. The Deperdussin racing plane was French, by the way. Looks very modern. Now, in order to fly his aircraft across, well, his aircraft or Wanamaker's aircraft across the Atlantic, Mr. Curtis decided to join forces with John Cyril Port. He's the one on the left there, without the mustache. Interesting character. He had built a two-seat glider around 1908, 1910, 1908, 1909. He later built a Santos Dumont Demoiselle, which is a little machine with, in some cases, pretty hectic or dangerous flying characteristic, a little firecracker of an airplane. So he certainly had an interest in aviation, but was not an aircraft engineer as such. There were no aircraft engineers at the time. 1914, the first flight. The reason Mr. Wanamaker wanted to try to fly in 1914 was, first of all, he wanted to be the first to do it. Well, not him, but his airplane. There was also the idea of the centennial of the end of the War of 1812, a war in which during which the UK was busy trying to strangle Napoleon. And again, no offense intended, but a conflict during which the United States tried to invade Canada, well, Ontario and Quebec, and failed. Again, no offense intended. So 1914, the flight didn't take place for a very good reason. Now, the image there is one of many images in color that were published in French newspapers. The Paris newspapers, some of them had like these weekly supplements, which in the front and the back, full page, like newspaper size color illustrations, glorious colors. This does not give you the gloriousness of the colors of the original image. You had anything in there, anything from car accidents to weddings to, in this case, assassinations, crowning of kings, anything you can think of was reproduced on a weekly basis by artists. I don't know how often they had to do these things, but the works, there are amazing works of art. Le Petit Journal, Le Petit Parisien, they've got like, it's amazing work. Now, this is the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his spouse in June 1914. The images are not necessarily, shall we say, accurate as far as the things that happened, but they were certainly based on what they knew at the time. Now, the assassin was basically a 20-year-old student. Oh, again, I will not read the text. It's a very puzzling character for many people in Eastern, Yugoslavia and, the former Yugoslavia. He's a hero because he assassinated this representative of the oppressive government of Austria-Hungary. For other people in Austria, for example, he is a terrorist. So you have the idea of someone's hero is someone else's terrorist and vice versa. And over time, it has happened in the past that the reviled terrorist became a revered politician. If you look at South Africa, for example, Nelson Mandela, who was not a terrorist, he was simply trying to free his people. He was accused of terrorism by the apartheid regime of South Africa, but eventually he became a revered statesman. Verlo Princip is a far more controversial individual. He died in 1918. He was badly treated in prison. He died of, tuberculosis and malnutrition. Again, very young. And that's how the First World War began. It was some sort of infernal machine that sort of got the Austrians in, then the Serbians. The Russians decided to support Serbia. The French, which were allied with the Russians, supported the Russian Empire. Germany, which was allied with Austria-Hungary, supported Austria-Hungary. The British, who were sort of like more or less allied with the French, not so much with the Russians, were involved, and everyone was dragged in. Well, everyone. A lot of people, most countries in Europe were dragged into this nightmare which was completely unnecessary. So 1914, you've got Mr. Port, who's back in the Royal Navy. He says that the Curtis America, it's certainly potential there to have a useful coastal patrol aircraft for looking out for ships. They might not have thought that submarines would be the deadly killing machines they turned out to be, but flying boats like the Curtis America could be useful. Now, the picture at the bottom, I believe, shows the original Curtis engines, which were a tad lacking in oomph, so were replaced by the picture on the top shows, I believe, Anzani radial engines, more powerful, but in the aircraft had some issues. So the small Americas, the H4s, were produced in fairly small numbers. You're looking maybe at less than 60 of them. As far as delivery dates are concerned, it's a bit puzzling. Rather puzzling. It's possible 1915-16, perhaps some of them as late 1917, although I have to wonder why, because the aircraft was not, as I would say, fantastic. Very lightly armed, perhaps one machine gun on the front, very lightweight bombs to be carried. It had issues, but again, Curtis was pushing the envelope at the time. Far from an ideal aircraft, but it was still a fairly large machine. Now, by September 1914, our friend Mr. Port was the head of RNAS Felixstowe, Royal Naval Air Service Station. And if you look at the map there, you've got the word Great Britain, and slightly to the, about 45 degrees to the right, you have Felixstowe flying, I think, base. That's where Mr. Port was based, and that's where he did a lot of his future development work. Now, Felixstowe was sort of like, if you look at France, Belgium by that time was pretty well invaded and taken over by the Germans, except for little parts around the northern border. Holland, well, the Netherlands, were a neutral country, so they were sort of like stuck between the Germans and the British and the French. It was a rather uncomfortable situation, with Denmark and Norway being neutral. Now, the North Sea and the Channel were areas where lots of submarines would be found eventually, because that's where a lot of shipping was being done, either from UK to France or some cases vice versa. But lots of supplies would be going from the UK to France and eventually went to the front. Because if you look at the French-Belgian border, that's pretty much, and all the way down to the city of Metz there, which is a French city now, but was a German city at the time. That's pretty much the line of, and perhaps a bit to the south of that, the line where the trenches were located. Actually, yes, to the south of that, because the Germans actually went quite deep into France by the end of 1914, although it didn't move a whole lot until 1918. All the work that Mr. Port was doing to develop and try to improve the capabilities of the small Americas led to the Felixstowe F1, or the Port one, which was the wings didn't change, the tail surfaces didn't change. It was a question of hull, design, and construction. Now, not being an engineer, it was a question of, well, let's try something. That didn't work. Okay, so let's try something else. Well, that's an improvement. Let's try something else with going more in that general direction. And eventually they got to something which was pretty darn good, and certainly better as a hull than that of the original Curtis America, being somewhat stronger, more aerodynamic, and not quite as complicated to build. Now you've got the first, more powerful H8 arriving in England. The design had some issues, which led Mr. Port to design another hull, bigger hull, which became the Port 2, or eventually Felixstowe F2, which was again an improvement. And I do believe that 3580, the aircraft on the image there, is that modified Curtis H8 with the new Port hull. There was a lot of improvisation being done at the time because he was not an engineer and the people with him were not engineers. They were simply doing this at the base that he was stationed with using the people from the area, which is Quite remarkable, actually. Now, I was watching, well, again, I will not read the text, apologies for that. But there was certainly an interest in flying boats because if you're looking at what was being done flying boat-wise in 1914, there were some, but Curtis had some expertise which was recognized among other people by the Russians. Now, that's a puzzling case because if you have two aircraft being shipped somewhere and both of them crash, you have to wonder, is it because they were damaged during travel, which was done by ship, of course? Were they improperly reassembled? Was it pilot error? Was it a flawed design? Was it all of the above, or was it something else altogether? In any case, the two aircraft crashed, and in one case, Mr. Janus, who was the pilot there, with the one on the photo on the right, lost their lives. The Danes also ordered an airplane. Now, the designation of Curtiss flying boats, I find them rather puzzling. For example, you have the H4, but was there an H1, 2, and 3? Or an H5 and H6? Or an H10 or 11? Or 15? So there's a bit of a puzzling history there. And that's only 100 years old, which explains why many things which happened like 500 years ago are completely unknown because we have no idea. 100 years ago, you would have thought there was documentation, but in some cases, it's been lost, misplaced, or it simply was not written down and preserved. Now, with the problems with the H8, Curtiss Aeroplane and Motor modified the other aircraft in that particular contract and delivered them as H-12s, which are the large America. So the H-12 is a large America, the H-16 is a large America. Not a lot of them were delivered. All of them from the US. The UK order was canceled. Aircraft manufacturing company, incidentally, through some various perambulations, eventually became de Havilland Aircraft. De Havilland Aircraft, you're looking at de Havilland Moth, de Havilland Mosquito, de Havilland Comet, the first jet-powered airliner. Now you're looking at photos of the H-12 here. Those are very large aircraft. Many people tend to think of First World War machines as tiny little rinkety thing with fabric, wood, metal wire. Well, that's pretty much what an H-12 was anyway, but it was certainly not a small rinky-dinky thing. It was big. These things carried several crew members, machine gun mount in the front, other machine guns in the back, could carry a few bombs. We're not talking tons here. We might be looking at maximum perhaps 500, 600 pounds and probably not very far. But they were not designed to bomb things. They were mainly designed for patrol work. As far as the U.S. Navy is concerned, because we haven't really talked about the U.S. Navy since the beginning of this, because by and large, the U.S. were neutral at the time. They were on the other side of the Atlantic, and well, this is not really our problem. Canada had a different issue, being part of at the time, the British Empire. It's a term I have some issues with. I'm from Quebec. The idea of monarchy is, I'm not a monarchist. Let's not go anywhere with that. But there were certainly issues with Canada joining the war, but as far as the United States was concerned, that only took place in 1917, and for very good reason. One of them was that one, well, let's have fun with this, the Zimmermann Telegram, in which Germany offered to help Mexico regain part of its territory along its border, like, well, California, New Mexico, Arizona, Texas, if it sided with Germany and attacked the United States, which the Mexicans found probably amusing, if not completely insane, because they were in the middle of a revolution at the time, and they knew very well that the Americans would make mincemeat out of them if they actually put their minds to it. But when the Americans were informed of this by the British, who had decoded the message in question, the US government was not amused, and even isolationist people from states like Texas, which were not too keen at the idea of going to fight in Europe, were enraged by what the dastardly deed the Germans were planning to do to them. So eventually the US joined the war. And I found that image, which because I certainly was looking for it. The idea of anti-submarine warfare. Up to 1917, it was done in I wouldn't say haphazard method, but fairly haphazard. You send aircraft out, you patrol, and you do things, and you sort of like try to sink German submarines, which was not very successful. But 1917, Germany decided, well, things are not going well. The US had not joined the war yet, but things are not going well. Let's reintroduce unrestricted submarine warfare. That is, we don't give any warning. We sink ships with our submarines underwater. They sink. Nobody survives. That's too bad. We're just going to sink everything we can because we have this issue with supplies coming from North America to Europe and also across the Channel to France, which led to great problems for the Royal Navy, which led to the introduction of a convoy system in that area, which in turn led to the introduction of what you see here is a spider web. Now, at the center of the web, you have a lightship, a Dutch neutral lightships. You don't touch the neutrals. You leave them alone. Now, the ship was used by German submarines as a navigation beacon, or a marker, to help them like cross from, well, Germany or certain other areas. Thus, it became the center of that spider web, which was used for about 18 months. Now, the dots you see there, you have submarine sighted and submarine bombed. So all in all, again, it's a question of when they bombed something, were they actually bombing something, or were they actually bombing a wave or bombing a whale? Although if I was a whale, I would not have stayed very long in the English Channel during the First World War. That was not a place to be. Same thing for dolphins. But about 40 submarines were attacked in that general area during the period of the spider web. Now, what you see, of course, in the picture is on the top left is England. On the right, you have the Netherlands. Zeebrugge is, I believe, in Belgium, but was probably occupied by the Germans. And you have the mouth of the Thames River, which is this gigantic opening into the United Kingdom. Now, the role of the anti-submarine aircraft, First World War, Second World War, was, well, if you can sink the submarines, that's good and fine, of course. But the idea was, I would say, primarily to keep them underwater. Now, a submarine on the surface can go reasonably fast, and cargo ships, especially in convoys, may not have been going very fast. So a submarine might be able to keep up and actually sort of do some damage. Underwater, their speed was greatly reduced, and their range was also greatly reduced. Because on the surface, they were using, good question, I'm not quite sure if it was gasoline engine or diesel engines, but they could certainly go long distances. Underwater, it's batteries. In 1914, 1918, batteries, you're not looking at lithium batteries here. They had a fairly limited capability, so they couldn't go very fast and they couldn't go very far. So by keeping them on the water, you were restricting their abilities to actually sink ships. And that was good, because in the end, the H-type or the F-type flying boats only sank one submarine. Now, there were suggestions that there might be one more, the UC-6, but by the looks of it, it hit a mine and, well, blew up. Well, big hole in the hull, ship sank, everyone died. Probably the same thing for UB-32. But the idea was not necessarily to sink submarines, as good as it was, but to keep them away from the cargo ships. Other flying boats of the H series, again, I will not read the text, nice painting, which shows what happens when you have an airplane close enough to a hydrogen-filled airship firing incendiary bullets. The pilot was a Canadian, Robert Leckie. The person firing was Mr. Galpin. Mr. Leckie got the credit for the victory, oddly enough. Possibly because he was the pilot, because he was certainly not the ranking officer on the flight. Sadly enough, the entire crew of the airship died. That's usually what happened when they crashed. Because once the hydrogen began to burn, the ship would sort of like very quickly lose altitude and would almost fall straight down. And since they were not wearing parachutes, technically they could, but most cases they left them at base because, well, it's extra weight, and if you can carry more fuel or more bombs or actually do something useful rather than carry parachutes you're not going to use, you hope. So they left them at home. And in many cases, it would have been almost impossible to use them anyway with the airship carrying up and down and going straight. You would not have been able to get out. Second one shot down in June 1917 by another flying boat of an H-12, I believe. Speaking of two airships, Mr. Leckie shot down two Zeppelins, the L-22 and the L-70 in August 1918. That time he was not in a flying boat, he was in a DH-4 bomber, which had been modified, well, used as a fighter plane. He was the gunner in the rear cockpit. This time he got the victory, which is very odd. I would have thought the pilot would have received it, but not that time. So Mr. Leckie is probably one of the few people, if not the only person in the First World War, certainly the only Canadian, with two Zeppelins to his credit, and a lot of dead people. By 1917, middle of 1917, F2A was coming online. The F2A was a production version of the F2, which was itself the development of the H8 with the port-developed hull, manufactured 175. You're not looking at it's mass production, quote unquote, series production, but you're not looking at thousands of aircraft like fighter plane like the Sopwith Camel or the French, the Nieuport or the Spad. It's fairly small numbers. In part because, well, they were big, they were expensive, yes, but the Rolls-Royce Eagle engines were not necessarily available in huge numbers either. So it was a question of priority. Who gets the engines? If maritime patrol has a slightly lower priority than bombing, because you need to defeat the Germans on the ground, because that's where the army is, that's where the trenches are. So they may not have had all the engines they could have used. Now, the idea of subcontracting was certainly a useful one, because you could use companies which had no really aircraft manufacturing experience, but could do woodwork. Very good machine, the F2. Surprisingly well armed, surprisingly agile. We're not looking at an airplane that could be looped, although we'll have something about that later. But it was quite agile and very effective in its role. In order to make it even more useful and to get it closer to the enemy, because that's what the British were very keen on, the idea of taking the fight to the Germans. Because unlike the French, well, they didn't have part of their country occupied, so they certainly wanted to get this thing over with. The idea of both countries were, and also the Germans for that matter, the idea of using lighters towed by destroyers, which could be taken close to the enemy shore. You lower the flying boat. They fly out, well, presumably more than one, because that would have been a tad dangerous. You fly in groups, small groups, to do some damage to bases near or on the German coast, or possibly also on the Belgian coast. All sort of crazy ideas were tried like that during the Second World War. Same thing for the flying boats themselves. There were test use of hydrophones, that is microphones, to listen to submarines. So you would land on the water, drop the hydrophone, rotate it, so you could figure out where the sound was coming from. So you could see, aha, the submarine is that way. Whether or not it worked is hard to say because, well, there were certainly lots of ships in the channel at the time, and if there were explosions, that probably would not have worked all that well. And something else which was tried was the Davis recoilless gun. It was an early example of a recoilless weapon, the idea being that you have a shell, you fire the shell, something comes out at the rear of the weapon, some sort of counterweight made of lead and possibly like grease. which has the same weight as the shell, which goes the other way, forward. Of course, you have to make sure that when you fire the thing, you're not aiming it that basically the cockpit is not behind you, because the pilot would be very crossed. Some of them were 2-pounders, 6-pounders, and 12-pounders. A 12-pounder is pretty much a 3-inch shell, so they were like pretty impressive weapons. They were not really used in combat a whole lot because they were sort of awkward, but they were certainly trying all sort of crazy ideas. The recoilless gun eventually became quite popular and successful during the Second World War. The Germans, the British used them. The Americans also used them, not using the similar principle of the Davis gun. Instead of using like a lead weight, a lead and grease weight, they used lots of gas moving backward. Another unusual aspect was the dazzle camouflage. Now, there were ships which carried dazzle camouflage like that. It was not so much to sort of like hide them, because if you're a submarine and you see something like that, I mean, you're not going to, well, this is not an elephant, this is a ship. The idea was that to make it more difficult to figure out if the thing was moving forward or backward, or at what speed it was going. Whether or not that actually was useful for a flying boat like that is open to question, but it certainly made identification easier. And again, if I may say so, it was fun. So if you have the possibility to do something like that, given the fairly young age of the crews, if you have the opportunity to sort of like, seriously, I can paint my airplane any color I want? Well, as long as we have the colors you want, yes. Oh, thank you, sir. Now moving to the next version of the H series. Looking at my notes very carefully. Another large America. This one was a bit peculiar because for all intents and purposes, it's a Felixstowe F2A made under license in the United States. Possibly with some tweaking, because my understanding is that there are some variants between like woods which are available in the UK are not necessarily available in the US and vice versa. And things like screw threads and various things might not be quite the same. Something that should be pointed out is that as far as the H-12s and H-16s are concerned, the ones used by the Royal Naval Air Service, as far as I know, made the crossing by ship, dismantled, and without engines. Because it made no sense to ship Rolls-Royce engines across the Atlantic with the risk of them being destroyed by submarines. It was a lot simpler to actually ship the aircraft, reassemble them, put the engines on, and then fly them into operation. Again, fairly small numbers of aircraft. Many of them were canceled because of the armistice, November 1918, sorry. US Navy ordered H-16s. It had ordered a few H-12s, but found them like not quite good enough. So they waited for the H-16, ordered a whole slew of them. That's a fairly sizable number, which was, interestingly enough, the first aircraft manufactured by the Naval Aircraft Factory in Philadelphia. Because the Navy had its own factory. Socialism in the United States during wartime. Well, in some cases, necessity breeds invention. You can see there again in the hall with the step, the large size of these things. Now, those would have been fitted with Liberty engines, because by that time you're looking, the Liberty engine had been developed, which I believe was more powerful than the Eagle, at least in some versions of the Eagle engine. By and large, by the end of the First World War, the Allies and their associate power, the United States, associated friends, you might say, had engines which were by and large more powerful than the Germans had. Liberty could deliver up to 400 horsepower. Eagles was definitely well over 300. The French were working on 400 horsepower engines as well, metric horsepowers. The Germans never got that far as production aircraft were concerned, as far as I know. Their machines are more aerodynamic, more advanced for structure, the use of steel tubes and aluminum alloy, for example. The Allies decided to stick with the wood, fabric, and metal wire, mass production, simpler. Not quite as efficient, but if you can't dazzle them with brilliance, you dazzle them with brilliance, you submerge them with numbers. As I mentioned earlier, something about looping. That's the person who did the loop. Personally, and I apologize, and again, no offense intended, I was never in the military. I would not have given a reprimand to that young man. I would have grounded him permanently. When you pull a stunt like that with crew members, I mean, come on. You're looking at a flying machine, flying boat, not very powerful, with a wingspan of almost 100 feet, and you're going to put it upside down. Come on. Again, apologies. No. The Felixstowe F2A was quite nice, very successful. It had some limitations, of course. All aircraft are compromises, and one of those limitations was range. So the F3 was developed, again, produced by companies which were not necessarily involved in aviation, but had people who could actually do work. Now, dynamo manufacturing stretches things a little bit, but from the looks of it, it worked. Now, the F3, and you see one of those in a factory. Now, during the First World War, when the war began, factories were, again, I'm almost not exaggerating here, the size of a typical classroom with 4 guys, a hammer, and a handsaw. By the end of the First World War, something like 175 or more thousand aircraft, that's 175 with 3 zeros, had been built. An industry had been created pretty well from scratch, with huge number of employees, many of them women, because the young men were at the front getting killed. Again, apologies, I'm not a military person. But you're looking at factories built from scratch, with huge spans in order to accommodate machines which were quite huge in some cases. Now, the F3 mainly used where German flying boats, well, German seaplanes and airships were unlikely to be seen because it was not quite as agile, but it did the work. As the paragraph at the bottom of the page says, and it's not a joke, some of them were made on the Isle of Malta using fabric made by local women, well, stitched by local women, supervised by the spouse of the governor of the Isle of Malta, Baroness Methuen. Who knew? I didn't. Little factoids like that. Now that's a sad part of the story. 1917, Ford was indicted, and a British civil servant, and someone from Curtis for, well, secret commissions, with a good part of the money staying with the civil servant as part of the deal. Now, in wartime, that sort of thing didn't go down too well. So Kissoon, who was not exactly a young man, he was almost my age. He was 64 at the time, a bit younger than me. He was fined a hefty sum, ordered to return everything, and pay the cost of the prosecution on top of it. Now, Port, he was already ill, he had tuberculosis. That's why he retired from the Royal Navy before the First World War. And he was still stuck with tuberculosis throughout the war. He was, I would say, given a pass. Although he did sort of agree to give back the money, which was almost like $3 million, like minus what he had spent. Seeley chose, which would have been a wise decision, or was told by the Curtis company not to make the crossing because, I mean, he couldn't be extradited. So basically, stay put, keep your mouth shut, and, well, go away. Eventually, I would say, he sued what was then Curtis Wright for, well, a share of the commission, which would have amounted to a huge amount of money. I think he wanted $3 million around 1932. He died, I think, before the thing actually got through the courts, which might have been lucky for Curtis Wright because in the early court decisions, they lost. Now, next chapter, you might say final chapter, the F5. Very promising. The catch was production of the F3 was still going on. So if you want to produce something else, which has improvements, which were like quite significant in some cases, you have to stop production. Now, if you stop production and you have losses of those aircraft, there might be issues with supply to the units. What do? Well, you compromise. The compromise was a hybrid between the F5 prototype and the F3, which then turned out to be no better than the F3. But it's understandable. These things do happen in wartime. Again, no offense intended. One could argue that the Curtiss P-40 remained in production after its prime. It was past its prime when it was retired from service because, again, it was in production. Stopping production, you have to retool to do something else. It takes time, and you need to win the bloody war. F5 was ordered in large numbers in the UK, but since the armistice took place, thankfully, after 9 million dead, lots of wounded, and something like 9 million dead from the Spanish flu on top of that, or more, because we simply don't know how many people died in places like Africa and Asia and South America, at least most isolated spot. Most of the F5s ordered by the British were cancelled. There were even some F5Ls powered with Liberty engines, which were going to be built in the UK, but were not. Now, US orders basically were 3 times the size of the British orders. Like something like 900 were cancelled. Again, the armistice, with many hulls being made by subcontractors. I find it ironic that Curtiss made aircraft, the F5Ls, with Liberty engines, which had been modified, which were basically a foreign version of the old H-12, H-16, well, H-12, which the F5 had itself been tweaked by the Naval Aircraft Factory to make it more, shall we say, amenable to American production methods and American materials and American tooling. Big aircraft. In Canada, it was the largest aircraft made until the mid-1930s and the rearmament of the Royal Canadian Air Force, because some of them were made in Canada. Now, Canadian Aeroplanes was in Toronto. Factory made to build airplanes, so it was designed for that in mind. Lots of space. Something like 1,300 Curtiss JN4 Canucks were made. More than half actually, were delivered to the American Armed Forces, the United States Army Service Corps, I believe, which was quite a large number. It was the first time that an aircraft had been mass produced in Canada. Very good company. Even the Americans recognize that Canadian airplanes, they do good shit. They do very good work. They're good, which probably explained why they got some contract, a contract to make F5Ls, 60. They only made 30. Again, the link with the British. The British Ministry of Munitions had this subsidiary in Canada, the Imperial Munitions Board, to supervise production of mainly ammunition. Now, other factories, you had anything from acetone, well, explosive, various types of products which were in need. The companies were created from scratch. Now, after the war, I understand that Canadian aeroplanes, because there was no market for military aircraft in Canada after all, the First World War was the war to end all wars. It was turned into, I believe, a company which made gramophones, which is a bit a pity, but there was no need for aircraft manufacturing in Canada, and there was no market for that anyway. Air Force was, there was a small Air Force, but you were not going to need huge numbers of aircraft, and commercial aviation did not really exist in Canada at the time. We're getting there. If you have like things to do, we're getting there. Now, both the F5s, British side, and the F5Ls, American side, were used for some years after the First World War. You have one there, and I do believe those are 2 US Navy battleships. I recognize these sort of like the funny geodetic towers of the one, certainly with the one in the foreground. Background, I think also, with the American star on them. Some interesting flights. There's, for example, a case of an F5 British flying from Scotland to southern Norway. That's 450 miles almost in July 1918, non-stop, in bad weather. So those were brave people. The idea was to do some sort of like tour of Scandinavia, possibly to help with sales of aircraft or build good relations, because I'm not quite sure if the relations with the Swedes and the Norwegians were very good during the First World War. How friendly the Norwegians and Swedes were toward Great Britain. Incidentally, the pilot of the aircraft which flew to Norway was Mr. Galpin. You will remember him. He's the one who shot down the airship in 1917 aboard the aircraft that Mr. Leckie, the Canadian pilot, was flying. Canada had some F series and some H series in the early 1920s. That was part of what was called the imperial gift. Every sizable dominion got an imperial gift of that sort. The South Africans, the Australians, the New Zealanders, I think, and certainly Canada. The idea was, well, air forces prove useful. Here are some aircraft. We're going to scrap most of them anyway, turn them into firewood, so you might as well have a few. As far as Canada was concerned, it was a question of like, what are we going to do with these things? It's not as if we have, well, we have a country to defend, of course. We have Canada, we want to defend Canada, but the only country which can actually threaten us right now is the only country we cannot defend ourselves against. That's the United States. Germany has been defeated. Japan was sort of like still reasonably friendly at the time. It had fought on the side of the Allies during the First World War. And in any event, there was no reason for the Americans to attack us because they own a good part of the economy. Incidentally, the photo right bottom with the camera, it's a fisheries patrol flight. They were probably doing some filming because there was a government's cinematographic unit. Some documentaries were produced during the early 1920s and 1920s, later years. Some really quite amazing material of flying boats over forests, because machines like that, I mean, were used, but not a whole lot, because they were not very practical. The big flying boats were not very practical. They were just too big to fly in the bush, but they were used some. Especially that one in the photo was one of the 6 aircraft which were used for the Trans-Canada flight in October 1920. That was the first time that aircraft, plural, had been used to fly from one coast of Canada, Nova Scotia, in the east, to the west coast of Canada, British Columbia, on the west. Now, the F3 flew about, I think it's probably not more than a third of the way, because it's about 3,300 miles, so it's about like 40% of the way, from Quebec, Rivière-du-Loup, to Winnipeg, Manitoba. Incidentally, the first seaplane to fly over central Canada, Kenora, October 10th, 1920. Kenora is near the border of Ontario and Manitoba. They had never seen something like that before, so it attracted a lot of people, as you might imagine. Canada was certainly not the place which was furthest away as far as usage was concerned. Images on the right show the F3 that Mr. Hordern ordered to be modified and used as a flying yacht for some years. It was probably quite comfortable, might have been a tad noisy. The one I find more interesting, I found references in newspapers. It's hard to say, well, hard to see where it went and hard to say how accurate it was. The idea of opium transport, but certainly opium was carried in China, into China, and by, shall we say, Westerners, British in particular. Because that's, for example, the Opium Wars of the 19th century is basically because the Chinese had the gall to prevent British ships from entering Chinese ports to deliver opium. So imagine the gall, the Chinese daring to actually say to the British, no, you can't do that. So the British simply turned around, declared war on China, and beat basically the CRAP out of them. Long live the empire. Again, sorry. First World War ending. What do we do with some of these flying boats? As you might imagine, most of them were scrapped, some of them were kept by the military, and a few of them were turned into airliners with a modified nose with large holes being drilled in the hull for windows. You could look outside, possibly with cotton wool in your ears because of the noise. Aero Marine was arguably the most famous arguably the first international airline in the United States. They moved from the US to Cuba, Bahamas, places where there was no prohibition. Now, whether or not they served some alcohol after they have gone beyond the shores of the United States, I don't know. But it's not entirely impossible that the airline itself did some smuggling of alcohol into the United States on the return trip, because Bahamas and Cuba were places where, well, Cuba you have rum, for example, so it might have been possible to smuggle a few things. Well, I have some stories. I heard some stories about Canadian aircraft, military, flying back from places with rum stored in all sort of funny places, but I won't go into that now. First in flight movie. Now, the gentleman with the white shirt, possibly Mr. Music, a pilot who apparently was involved in some alcohol smuggling, presumably with the full knowledge of the mucky mucks of Aeromarine. Later on, he became one of the great pilots of Pan American World Airways, of course. Handheld operator, handheld projector, very sort of like homey. Not quite sure how stable the picture would have been, but it was certainly an interesting stunt. Now, I came across that one several years ago. Again, I will not read the text, but I will point to the propellers of the aircraft. Those are not wooden propellers. I think, and I hope I'm not mistaken, that those are adjustable pitch metal propellers made by Standard Steel. So because if you were using these aircraft during the 1920s, it might have made sense to fit propellers which were a bit better performing. Just saying. On the left, you have the menu. So the most expensive sandwich stand on planet Earth. Whether or not there was seating outside, I don't know. Fascinating stories about that. I mean, apparently at some point there was a bit of a miniature zoo near the mystery ship. Whether or not it was after or before 1935, I'm not sure. I even read somewhere or someone mentioning to me that there were some monkeys that were kept in cages, which at one time escaped and became very happy in the neighborhood because, man, it was a jungle. They loved it. Of course, they're not there anymore, but if the story was true, they might have survived for some time. Pity, which is a real pity. That particular F5L did not survive until today, although it would have been pretty battered by the 1960s. Now, what was Mr. Port doing during that time? He lost basically the opportunity to win some medals, at least one, perhaps two, as a result of his, shall we say, financial shenanigans. He may not have done it he did not necessarily want to defraud, but it didn't look good. He joined Gosport Aircraft in engineering, well, in 1919. One of the aircraft he worked on, which was never built, was that one here. You're familiar with the water bombers? Of course, in the United States, California, for example, the West Coast, Canada also, with the change in the weather, climate change, water bombers, well, that's the first one, as far as I know, was designed not to drop waters, that's a different thing, was designed to carry a small team of firefighters as close as possible to a fire, disembark them with little boats, possibly like either inflatable or like boats could be taken apart, or foldable boats with their little fire pumps and shovels and bags of sand perhaps, and get them as close as possible to a fire so they could take care of small fires before they became big fires. Incidentally, in the mid-20s, the Royal Canadian Air Force put into service the Canadian Vickers Varuna, which was the first water bombing aircraft, quote unquote, which used that same principle. Fly to the side of a forest fire or as close to it as possible, disembark the team of firefighters, and repeat. Now, the Varuna was a bit lacking in performance, especially the production version. The Air Force wanted more bells and whistles, but the power of the engine was not quite as high. So the production version was not as good as the prototype, which was a bit odd. The Varuna was followed by Vancouver, metal hull, much better airplane, around 1929, 1930, but produced in very small numbers because of, again, budgets were small and there was a Great Depression. But water bombing, to a large extent, is a Canadian invention, and we are very good at it. Sadly, of course, Mr. Port would not know that. He was 36 when he died, very well, like results of stress, tuberculosis. It was a great loss. Now, besides Canada, again, I will not read. Japan played a role in the history of the F-boat series. They bought a few, they got the rights, and having obtained the rights, they set out to build some. Yokosuka Naval Arsenal and the Hiro Naval Arsenal, as well as Aichi. Now, the Yokosuka, well, became also an aircraft manufacturing concern later on. Aichi continued to be an aircraft manufacturing later on. Interesting business, however, watch and electric manufacturing. That, I believe, would be an F5 manufactured in Japan, which led to the first fully Japanese flying boat, still closely related to the F5, which was the Type 15, the Hiro Type 15, manufactured in, well, fairly small numbers, because orders, military aircraft were fairly small at the time, because, I mean, the war was over, there were huge numbers of war surplus machines, and it was thought that wars would not erupt for a while, although it didn't turn out to be quite wrong. There were conflicts. You're looking at South America, you're looking at China in 1931, looking at also the, I would say, the police actions of the Royal Air Force in the Middle East, terrorizing populations. Now, all of those, of course, were made of wood. Metal is a lot better because wood absorbs water. And if you spend a lot of time on, for example, on a lake in Canada or on the shore of the Channel or off the shore of California, and if you spend any time in the water, you're going to absorb some of that water, which can build up and can reduce your payload by several hundred pounds, which is not good. So using metal, short, the Tin 5, was so good that afterward, the Royal Air Force decided no more wooden flying boats. And it is the Royal Air Force, because at that time, naval aviation was the purview of the Royal Air Force. The Royal Navy did not control naval aviation in the UK at that time, which is a bit peculiar, but that's the way it was. In the United States, similar thing. It was the F5L which led to the development of metal hulls and aircraft, indirectly, very much around the same time, mid-1920s. Even better, the F5L led to PN12 and its derivatives. Now, topping that off, besides the metal hull British, metal hull American, you have metal hull Japan, also based on derivatives of the F5, F5L. So, very significant family of aircraft, the H series and the F series. Curtiss and Felixstowe. Curtiss being a company and Felixstowe never being a really company. It was a naval aviation base. So, very significant. Sadly enough, there's the half-covered hull in storage, I believe, in Air and Space, unless it's with the National Museum of Naval Aviation. That I don't know. I forgot to check. Sorry about that. There's also the nose section of an F5 in England, small museum. one of those many small aviation museums you find in the United States and the UK. But still, lots of pictures, lots of information, lots of souvenirs. Canada Aviation and Space Museum has a lot of photos of various F series and H series, and I have no doubt that Air and Space or the National Museum of Naval Aviation or the National Archives have lots of pictures of those flying machines and their crews. So that's it for me. Hopefully, not too many people fell asleep or were insulted.